Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we review the political highlights of 2021 and ask two of our favourite soothsayers, what can we expect from Westminster politics in 2022? In a few short weeks, Prime Minister Johnson has moved from master of all he surveyed to a lame duck, drowning in self-inflicted scandal. What will the new year bring? A political revival for the Prime Minister or end game for the Johnson administration? We interview top political commentator Peter Oborne and the very independent peer Baroness Clare Fox and ask them what exactly is going on and, more importantly, what will happen next. But first, to your tweets, emails and messages in response to our show last week on rounding up of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Michael McGuigan says the planet's going back to its formation as it did billions of years ago. Ira Dobson says the realistic carbon capture cost is ridiculous and a commercial joke at best. Robert Dowd says doomed. With the leaders we have, definitely doomed. And finally, on a lighter note, William Nicholl says, I'm certain that all music and my therapeutic art have kept me sane these last years. Some might say different. What an interesting programme, once again focusing on some of the good. Thank you all at the Alex Salmond Show. Now, no journalist has been a bigger thorn in the Prime Minister's side than the formidable Peter Oborne. Earlier this year, he published The Assault on Truth, detailing the full extent of Boris Johnson's repeated departures from the actuality. Are we therefore approaching journey's end for Johnson? Alex speaks to Peter Oborne.
Peter Oborne, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a huge pleasure to be back with you, Alex. I do apologise not for being with you in person.
Well, we've got you on the screen, Peter. That's a very good second best. So, listen, you've been looking at the Tory party for many, many years. Have you ever seen turmoil like this at the top of the Tory party, or is this just another cycle of Tory internal internecine warfare?
No, this is different. Because it's a crisis. I think it's quite important to remove this issue from Johnson himself, disgraceful and hapless and wretched though he is. It's important to realise this is a crisis of the Conservative Party, which has collapsed as a responsible civic organisation and has become the product of donors and interest groups. And what is really at stake here is not wretched Johnson, who's finished, by the way. He will go. Don't have any doubts about that. But what happens next?
But can I put it to you that there's nothing that's happening now. I mean, if we're talking about selling honours and peerages, I mean, Stanley Baldwin was up to his neck when Monday Gregory was convicted all these years ago, the only person to be convicted of purveying honours and peerages, and that was way back in the 1920s and 30s. So what's new about the accusation of selling peerages?
Well, not talking specifically about selling peerages, although that is an issue hanging over the party. But no, there are three matters which are up in the air and over which Johnson has no control, which are he confronts this week. The one is the Cabinet Secretary, Simon case, and he is looking into the parties. And the parties are really difficult because it appears that the Prime Minister, even though I think he's denying they took place, but anyway, that he broke COVID rules. Now, if Mr. Case, he was over-promoted, but he has his future reputation to consider, concludes that Mr. Johnson and his the kind of rather unsavoury associates who surround him broke the rules, then I feel the consequences of that will be serious. Then we have another matter, which is even more serious than that, and that is the Lord Gate judgment about whether or not he was lied to or misled, to use parliamentary language, by Mr. Johnson over the matter of the funding of the wallpaper and internal decorations in Mr. Johnson's flat. Now, I don't know how closely you've followed it, but it's potentially deadly serious. So when it emerged that a Tory donor had helped out Johnson, has put his hands in his pocket to sort out Johnson, Johnson said to Lord Geit when he carried out his investigation that the first he'd known about it was in February this year, following media reports. When the Electoral Commission did its report, it found an evidence that Mr. Johnson had WhatsApped this donor to ask for cash. Now, does this mean that he was lying, or is there some innocent explanation? There's been radio silence from Lord Geit. Now, Lord Geit's a serious figure. He's a former army officer, former diplomat, former private secretary to the Queen.
And an Islesman, of course, a man with Western Isles connections, not to be trifled with.
Absolutely not. You don't trifle with the clans, you never have. Now, the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards must examine the failure by the Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, to declare in a proper way donations he received, as any MP must. Now, if she finds him guilty of failing to do so, it's a serious offence. And what is the remedy she has? Expelling or suspending or ordering out for a certain set of time the MP from Parliament. Now, if Mr. Johnson, the Prime Minister, is banned from Parliament, he won't be able to perform his duties as answering questions, coming to the House, making statements, etc. So these three very weighty matters hang over the Prime Minister at a moment when confidence in him has collapsed among backbench Tory MPs and his ministerial colleagues. Now, I conclude, I have reached that conclusion for some time, that he is finished. He is now a posthumous Prime Minister. He's the living dead. And at some point, probably but not before Christmas, but certainly in the new year, he will be obliged to resign. That is the matter as it now stands.
Now, you've been the Prime Minister's, in journalistic terms, his bête noire. You've been his nemesis. You produced a book detailing all his evasions of the actuality, let's call them that.
No lies. I call them lies. In the book, having taken legal advice, repeated lies made to the British people about Brexit, about coronavirus, and almost everything else you care to mention. There they are in my book, The Assault in Truth. He hasn't sued me. Nobody's challenged a single dot or comma of that book. And now I'm running a website itemising the current lot of lies, which are pouring out.
But he's not the first Prime Minister who has been demonstrated to have been economical with the truth. I mean, in Boris Johnson's defence, his lies seem over relatively, as you call them, over relatively trivial matters, whereas Mr. Blair could be accused of misleading people about the reasons for going to a war. So in the balance of things, isn't Boris Johnson somewhat less guilty than his Labour predecessor?
You are speaking probably to the leading expert, and not just in Britain, but the world, on British political lying. I wrote a book about Mr. Blair called The Rise of Political Lying, and I went into the terrible untruths which Mr. Blair told about the existence of weapons of mass destruction, which paved the way in propaganda terms and actually in legal terms, I think, for an illegal war. So that was deadly serious. The Iraq War is the consequences for millions of people in death, destruction, and of course the dispossession is still being felt. The Blair lie over weapons of mass destruction, and I shall say that Mr. Blair insists he made those statements in good faith, and therefore they were merely false, not lies. It's an important distinction to make. Those lies were largely relating to the Iraq War, whereas I'm afraid Johnson, you name it, coronavirus, Brexit, his personal circumstances, it's every day.
Tell me a bit about the Tory party. I mean, is it the case, if you were cynical, the Tory party tolerate Boris Johnson because he's seen as an election winner. But it's actually the moment he ceases to be seen as an election winner and becomes a liability that the famous men in grey suits start to line up to tell the Prime Minister the game's a bogey. Unlike
the Labour Party, the Tory party is a completely ruthless electoral machine. The moment, it's like being a football manager, actually. The moment you cease to deliver results, out you go. Now, this is so Mr. Johnson was seen as, and was popular, very popular for some reason, with the British people for a long time. He won them that election. They put him in for that. Now, over the last few weeks, he started to crash in the polls as a result of, and I want to name her, Pippa Crerar, political editor of the Daily Mirror. What a hero. What a justification and a vindication of political journalism. I'm proud to be a fellow citizen of Pippa Crerar, who broke the revelations about those parties. And ever since that, the Johnson poll rating has collapsed and is now in negative territory, and the Tory rating has collapsed. If that carries on for much longer, it's over and out. And so if it is over and out, game's up for the Prime Minister, who would the likely successors be? And there are any dark horses as well as the obvious favourites? Yes, I think I would. You've got to divide within the Cabinet and outside the Cabinet. And conventional Westminster opinion will tell you that Liz Truss has got a bit of je ne sais quoi, a bit of Mrs. Thatcher. She's the Foreign Secretary now, and she's well placed to run, and probably will do. Likewise, Rishi Sunak, a bit less flashy, but he's quite credible as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And then on the outside, I'll give you two names. I'm going to give you Jeremy Hunt, the former Foreign Secretary, former Health Secretary, is really quite a formidable figure. He ran second against Johnson in the leadership election 2 years ago, and he represents a sort of standing rebuke to the should we call it corruption, the mendacity, the sleaze, the cronyism, which has marked Johnson's disgraceful term as Prime Minister. Now, the problem for Sunak and Liz Truss and anybody in the Cabinet, that they've gone along with this. They haven't protested. And they are smeared by association with somebody who is becoming one of the most noxious politicians of modern times. Outside is Hunt. And the other person I'll give a little mention to, David Davis, who he ran second to David Cameron 10 years ago. And he's a figure of considerable integrity and a standing rebuke to the moral squalor of the ghastly crew which now surrounds Boris Johnson. Now, very finally, Peter Oborne, as the Parliamentary Conservative Party and their acolytes celebrate the new year, are they going to be really depressed about the current circumstances? Or are they going to say, well, look, we've got a majority of 80 in Parliament, there's more than 2 years to the next election, so listen, we've got time to sort things out. So are they going to see their glass of malt whiskey half full or half empty? The fundamental feeling, and I've tested it among Tory MPs, is that Johnson is finished. And the Tory party cannot, is now behind in the poll ratings. That will get worse with, as I explained, a series of fresh scandals coming swiftly round the corner with the speed of an express train. So they will get rid of Johnson in the new year if they don't strike before. Peter Oborne, student of the Conservative Party, journalist extraordinaire, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show. A great pleasure, Alex.
Join us after the break, where Alex asks Baroness Clare Fox to gaze into her political crystal ball and tell us what 2022 will bring. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Well, it's been a torrid few weeks for the Prime Minister, but will 2022 see a recovery in his fortunes, Or will the apocryphal Tory men in grey suits come a-calling on Downing Street? Alex is in conversation with the liveliest of the new members of the House of Lords, ennobled by Johnson not because of her donations to the Conservative Party, but because of her campaigning for Brexit. Does she think the man who got Brexit done can hang on to power? Alex speaks to Baroness Clare Fox.
Baroness Clare Fox, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Good to be here.
What would you say is the extent of the Prime Minister's political troubles? How much trouble is Boris Johnson now in?
He's in a lot of trouble, but maybe not the way people think. I suspect that in the last few days there's been some kickback. People are worried that Theresa May and others are out for revenge. There's concern because quite a lot of people who are the hardcore Remain crowd have been enjoying his troubles a bit much. And so that makes people who voted for him a little nervous because they might want to hold Boris Johnson to account, but for the right things. And they don't want him to kind of end up with, somebody they don't consider will be in the spirit of why they voted for Johnson in the first place. Having said all that, he's lost a huge amount of support, I would suggest, from the voters that he won over, from the Red Wall voters, because they now really do feel as though any kind of liberal or liberty-embracing instincts have been betrayed. I think COP26 did him a lot of damage because a lot of people felt that this was a kind of jamboree of international, heads of state and all sorts of NGOs talking about issues that would be done to them. And they didn't really feel as though net zero is something that had been politically, democratically decided on. And now the recent COVID regulations coming in when people just don't feel as though they're justified and the party's issue. So one way or another, there's a real sort of sense of we might stick with him, but it's a real through gritted teeth. And that's very damaging, I think.
How much of the Prime Minister's troubles are self-inflicted? There seems to be almost an element of carelessness about things. And COP26, he didn't seem to seize the moment for global publicity like the President of the United States or indeed the First Minister of Scotland.
Well, I think that word that you've used is very important, which is carelessness. I think that his charisma cannot compensate for the fact that he actually is quite careless. And politically, that has big impacts on people because if you're constantly trying to implement policies to cover up for the last mess that you made, then people start to lose confidence in your ability to hold the line or have any sincerity. I mean, the people I know at the moment, for example, are going along with the restrictions. They're wearing their masks, they're doing everything they're told. But last year they were frightened. This year they're not frightened, they're complying. It's a very different atmosphere, and a lot of it's done in bad faith because they're doing it because they'll get in trouble if they don't do it. It's not quite the same. And if you think that they then think that Boris Johnson just seems cavalier about these announcements, he can casually just say on the television that the whole of the NHS is going to be repurposed to do booster jabs, and not one doctor or nurse had been told that, right? I mean, this is like, you can say, I support the NHS, but if you treat people like that, he can bring in legislation, things like the police and crime bill, that they say they're doing for one reason, but when you actually look at the small print, really will criminalise all sorts of activities that most ordinary people wouldn't support. And he doesn't seem to know that detail. That's just something one of his ministers is doing. Well, he needs to know the detail. He's in charge. So I think he's brought a lot of it on himself. But I just don't want to underestimate his popular appeal. But if you want, what I think has happened is he's still got popular appeal, but he used to have a populist instinct. Just spontaneously, it was just something he was good at. He had a populist instinct, and now he has lost that populist instinct. He doesn't actually have that same sense of what ordinary people think.
But he does carry a bit of luck, doesn't he? I mean, if you take last week where he seemed to be drowning in a sea of sleaze allegations, and then along comes a new dangerous variant which allows him to make a prime ministerial broadcast, to proclaim booster, 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 and wipe the Christmas parties or gatherings, at least for now, off the headlines.
For now, but you see, that's the thing is, why people are cynical is because they don't think it's a very dangerous variant. They think a variant has come along that is being conveniently and opportunistically used to wipe away the problems. Now, I'm not saying it isn't dangerous, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is there's a cynicism, a kind of almost a nihilistic cynicism, that people aren't quite convinced by this one, because actually, if you look at the evidence, it doesn't look as though it's that dangerous. And he's behaving as though we're back to stage one, or we're on Delta, or, you know, and it's obviously not like that. And so, but yeah, I mean, he has a certain amount of luck, but you can't rule by luck, you know, that only lasts for so long. People won't forget this.
It's quite interesting. We're having this conversation about the fate of the Prime Minister, and we haven't yet mentioned the Labour Party. It's almost suggesting that all of Boris Johnson's potential difficulties come from either within the Tory party or out with from the press. But where did the Labour Party stand in all of this?
I thought one of the key indicators that the Labour Party really are irrelevant was when Keir Starmer did a State of the Nation broadcast the evening after Boris Johnson did his State of the Nation, and the nation didn't really notice. I think the last time I was on the show, I said I think the Labour Party have had it, and I think the Labour Party have had it. It's just that things don't just die overnight, right? But it doesn't mean that I think they've got the potential for a sustainable future as the party of Labour. I just don't think they have. Ordinary working people no longer naturally look to Labour, and Labour have done nothing in which they might convince them that they should look to them.
So what do your guts tell you, Baroness Fox? Are the men in grey suits going to come calling on Downing Street, or is there going to be a Prime Minister revival in the new year?
I think that the men in grey suits are already circling, and they certainly are asking for the grown-ups to enter into number 10. And there is no doubt about it that Boris has always had a slightly, to use your words again, careless and cavalier attitude to organisational matters. But when he was in City Hall, he did have a reasonably strong team around him, and it does seem to me that one of the problems is that lack of team. So they will try and change personnel and hope that works. But I think that more and more people realise that he has limited value. It's just that there isn't anyone obvious, you know. You just who, Dominic Raab, Michael Gove.
Well, I mean, the Foreign Secretary, perhaps.
Well, only at the most shallow level. I mean, nobody really believes. Liz Truss is playing a blinder, right? But if you kind of examine it for more than 2 minutes, I don't know whether she's got the national reach that Boris Johnson has. There will be people who've got their eye on the big job. I just don't think his days are numbered in quite that way.
And does the Prime Minister, in your estimation, still have the will to be Prime Minister? I mean, many Prime Ministers come to the end of their tether. They just get fed up with it.
I think that he wants all the glory and not the hard work. So, you know, the difficulty is that whether he's actually got the genuine stamina, the stamina that is required to really lead, because it's fine, you know, making great speeches. And when I say great speeches, I mean rhetorically clever, people laughing, being in the limelight. But actually, as he has obviously noticed, it's quite hard running a country. It's quite hard being on the international stage, and you can make mess-ups. And he does it all the time, and people are less forgiving in this. You know, what everyone thinks about COVID, this is a serious crisis. He keeps telling us that. A time for the serious grown-ups. And yet he doesn't really want to be a serious grown-up in this. And his statesman-like standing is, to say the least, slightly in disarray. Ruthlessly ambitious men, what can you do with them, right? They don't give up that easily. He's not going to go quietly either, I'd have thought.
But can you rationalise how a Christmas party last year can have more political impact than the question as to whether a house, a legislature, is being bought for money?
Because the Christmas parties issue indicated that the people who were making the rules were not frightened of this virus that they told us that we had to be so frightened of, that ordinary people were, you know, destroyed their hopes and aspirations. I mean, if you remember this time last year, everyone I knew was so excited, you know, seeing the family for the first time. The gut-wrenching idea that you were taken for a mug, the British people don't like that. They've gone to the pub, they've chatted to each other, and they've discovered that society was almost destroyed during that time. And they know that that is a big price to pay. And maybe some of them think it was worth it because we had a public health emergency. To then discover that that wasn't being taken seriously by the people who actually closed society down, I think has really got to people.
Clare Fox, I want you to look into that crystal ball, which I know you have, and tell our viewers what's going to be, in your opinion, the political highlight of the coming year, 2022.
I'm hoping that the political highlight will be that the public will re-emerge into society again and become agents of their own destiny and be like active players in the story. Because one of the problems about closing society down is there's too much focus on what happens in Parliament. And Parliament are kind of talking in a bubble to each other. And what I'm looking forward to is people regaining their confidence and reasserting the fact that they're the ones in control and in charge. And I think that maybe I'm hoping that the cynicism that's a bit nihilistic about politicians will become a productive, dynamic force, and that we'll see a shake-up with new political parties emerging of all sorts and stripes, and so that the ruling elite just can stop being as complacent as they have been over the last year.
Clare Fox, thank you so much. And you'll come back onto the show to tell us about that festival of politics.
I will do.
In the new year.
Boris Johnson went into November as a Prime Minister ahead in the polls, backed by a comfortable Commons majority and with an improving situation on all key fronts. The COVID pandemic was stabilised, if not under full control. The economy was out of lockdown and performing better than forecast. And Britain was preparing to stage a major international summit in Glasgow. But 8 weeks is a long time in politics. All has been rapidly downhill. The Prime Minister's ill-judged attempt to save his friend Owen Paterson from the Standards Committee failed and then rebounded badly. It opened up a range of questions about Downing Street activities during lockdown, which seemed to suggest that the regulations were only meant for ordinary people and not for the Johnson inner circle. Above all, the failure to shake off Slee's allegations and his apparent lack of attention to the detail of governance has begun to connect with his ability to command support for necessary action to tame the resurgent virus. Now, when a Prime Minister becomes both an electoral liability and is incapable of governing on the major issue of the day, these are exactly the circumstances when the Tory party instinct for survival kicks in. Incumbents are then expected to do the decent thing. Having said that, there is no evidence that Boris Johnson throughout his political career has operated within the normal parameters of what is expected of him. Thus, it may be too early to write his political obituary, regardless of the number of people now volunteering to be the lead author. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, take care, and we hope to see you all again for our Christmas special with a duo of many voices, the talented Kate Robbins and Lewis MacLeod, next week. Until then, take care.